Hey guys, today we're learning the opening riff to Tears in Heaven by Eric Clapton. This is a beautiful riff and it's perfect for you beginner intermediate finger pickers who want to learn something that's not Travis picking, but that's still engaging and super fun to play. For how short it is, it's only 4 measures. This riff has quite a few chords in it, 7 chords to be exact, and the way he plays these chords is interesting. Each chord is played with just 3 notes, 2 high notes played on the G and B strings, and a bass note played either on the A string or the low E string. Your index and middle fingers on your right hand are in charge of the high notes, and your thumb, of course, plays the bass notes. And I actually like to keep my ring finger planted here on the high E string as well, just because it kind of stabilizes my hand and gives me a reference point for the other strings, and it has the added benefit of keeping the string muted. The chords are A major, E over G sharp, F sharp minor, F sharp minor 7 over E, D over F sharp, E7 sus4, E7, and then we end the progression with the same chord we started with, A major. A major is also our key, so our chord progression is 1, 5, 6, 4, 5, 1. We start with a hammer-on from the open low E string to the 2nd fret. Those 2 notes make up what's called a pickup measure. A pickup measure is just a partial measure at the beginning of a piece of music. And the reason we have pickup measures is because sometimes a song starts before the 1 count. Most of the time it's just 1, 2, 3, 4 start, but in this song the music actually starts on the and of 4. So in this one we have 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And just a heads up, we don't count pickup measures as actual measures. So when I say the first measure or the second measure, I'm referring to the first or second full measure after the pickup. After that pickup measure, we land on the open A string, and we're now on our first chord, which is A major. So we're going to hit our open A, and then we're going to lay down our 2nd fret bar as we hit the G string, and then the B string, and that's our A chord. So we have A, C sharp, which is a root, 3rd voicing. Now right here, Clapton does something kind of fancy called a triplet. Right after hitting the B string, he does a quick hammer on to the 3rd fret, and then immediately pulls off back to the 2nd fret. So 3 quick notes. If you're more toward the beginner end of the spectrum and that feels a little over your head, don't worry about it. You can leave that triplet out and it'll still sound totally fine. But if you can do it, or if you think you can learn how to do it, it does add a bit of sparkle to the riff. I'm going to play it both ways at the end of the segment, so you'll be able to hear what the difference is. All right, after that triplet, we hit the G string 1 more time, and we're done with our A chord. And once we're done with the A chord, we don't have any more flourishes or anything like that. So for the rest of the riff, our left hand's just going to be holding whatever chord we're playing, and our right hand is going to be hitting either all 3 strings, just the high notes, or just the bass note. Our next chord is E over G sharp. And the term over in a chord name means that the bass note, the lowest note in the chord, is not the root note. It's not the note that the chord's named after. This chord is voiced G sharp, B, E, or 3rd, 5th root. So it's an E chord, but the root note is not in the bass, so that means we can't just call the chord E and be done with it. We have to specify that it has that G sharp in the bass. So we say E over G sharp, chord over bass note. Chords like this are often referred to as slash chords because of how they're written, letter slash letter. The more technical term, though, is inversion. Inverting something in everyday language means to turn it upside down or put it out of order in some way, right? And that's actually exactly what we're doing when we invert a chord as well. We're taking a note that's typically in the middle or on the top of a chord and moving it to the bass. The E over G sharp chord can be played in a few different ways. The way I like to play it in this riff is 2nd finger, 3rd finger, 4th finger, because I think this is the easiest way to get to it considering where we're coming from on the A chord. But if that fingering feels too hard for you, if it's too big of a stretch, you can try playing it like this, 1st, 2nd, 4th finger, or you can even try using your thumb on the low E string, like that. Our right hand sequence for the E over G sharp chord is very short. It's just all 3 strings, then just the high strings. Now we're not quite done with the first measure yet, but the majority of the next chord takes place in measure 2, so let's stop right here and play what we have so far, and I'm going to count while I do this so you can get a feel for the rhythm. So first without the triplet, 3 and 4 and a 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Then with the triplet, 3 and 4 and a 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. The next chord, which as I mentioned starts at the very end of the first measure, is F sharp minor. And for this one, you're going to bar all 3 strings on the 2nd fret. That gives us F sharp, A, C sharp, which is our root, 3rd, 5th voicing. The right hand sequence is all 3 strings, just a low string, then just the high strings. Then we have our first and only rest of the riff. And rests mean silence, so we want to actively mute the strings by planting our right hand fingers. Because if we don't mute those strings, we're not doing a rest, we're just letting the notes ring. After that we have F sharp minor 7 over E, so it's another inversion. The only difference between this chord and the F sharp minor that preceded it is that our low note is now the open E. That gives us a 7th, 3rd, 5th voicing. This is another chord that can be played a few different ways, but I'm going to recommend you play it like this with your 2nd and 3rd fingers, and you'll see why when we get to the next chord. Our right hand sequence for this chord is just high strings, low string, high strings, low string. And that's the end of the 2nd measure, which means we're halfway through the riff. So starting from the F sharp minor chord at the very end of the first measure, this is what we have for measure 2. And 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. The next chord is D over F sharp. And if you notice, it's the exact same shape as our E over G sharp, just a couple frets lower. But you might also notice I'm using a slightly different fingering for this one. Well, just like the E over G sharp, I chose this fingering because I think it works best considering the chord we're coming from and the chord we're going to go to after it. This chord is voiced F sharp, A, D, which, just like the E over G sharp, gives us a 3rd, 5th root voicing. Our right hand sequence for this one is all 3 strings, low string, high strings, low strings. So next we move to E7 sus4, which is voiced E, A, D for a root 4th, 7th voicing. And notice how all we have to do to get to this chord from the D over F sharp is lift up our index finger. And that's why I chose that fingering for the D over F sharp, because it makes that transition so easy. We're on this chord for a very short amount of time, just long enough to do an all strings, low string right hand sequence. That's followed by E7, which is almost the same chord, but our A moves down to a G sharp, which is a 3rd instead of a 4th. And we're on this chord for an equally short amount of time with a right hand sequence of high strings, low string. And that's it for the 3rd measure, so here's what that sounds like all together. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And finally, the 4th measure is the easiest one of all. We're back to A major for the whole thing, and you can either play this chord the same way we played the first A, with the bar on the 2nd fret, or I actually like to play it like this with fingers 2 and 3, because I find it just a little easier to get to this from the previous chord. Our right hand sequence is all, low, high, low, high, low, high. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So throughout the lesson, I've been giving you the voicings of each chord. And what we've seen is that A, each chord is made up of just 3 notes, right? And B, we have a mix of what we'd call root position chords with the root notes in the bass, and inversions where the root note is not in the bass. But what we haven't addressed is the most important question, which is why? Why use 3 notes per chord instead of 4 or 5 or 6? And why use inversions rather than all just normal root position chords? Well, as far as the 3-note voicings, I can't say for sure why he chose those, but I can make an educated guess, and really, that's the best we can ever hope for when it comes to the question of why somebody made a certain creative choice. So here's my take. The kind of pared down voicings that we see in this riff create a lot of sonic space. Imagine if it was possible for us to play every single note on the guitar at the same time. That's a lot of notes, and that would take up a lot of sonic space, right? It would be hard to focus on any one note or hear the subtle interaction between any 2 or 3 notes because there'd be kind of an information overload going into your ears. Well, on a much smaller scale, a chord with 6 notes in it is going to take up twice as much sonic space as a chord with just 3 notes in it. So that 3-note chord is going to allow us to hear the subtleties of each note and how the notes interact with each other a lot more clearly than the 6-note chord will. In other words, the fewer notes you play, the more significance each note takes on. It's the whole less is more idea. So to my ears, these sparse chord voicings impart a sense of intimacy that you don't really get with bigger chords. As far as the inversion root position thing, I feel like I can get into his head a little bit more with this one. And that's because 99% of the time when a chord progression contains a lot of inversions, those inversions are there so that the bass notes move in a logical fashion from one chord to the next. So here's what I mean. From the first chord to the second chord, our bass note goes from A to G sharp, so down a half step. In the third chord, the bass note moves down a whole step to F sharp, then it moves down another whole step to E. So we have these bass notes that are walking down the scale, which creates a very connected sounding line from chord to chord. Now compare that to how the bass line would sound if all the chords were in root position. It's not bad, right? There's nothing wrong with that. It just doesn't have the same kind of flow from one chord to the next that the inversions give you. And the bass movement in the second half of the riff is just as logical. The walk down from the first half, of course, has to end when we get to the low E because we can't go any lower than that. So what's the next best thing? Start moving back up the scale, which is exactly what we do when we go to our D over F sharp. Then the bass moves back down to E, and then right at the end, we break that walking pattern by jumping all the way back up to A. But that doesn't mean that we've abandoned our logical bass movement. That jump from E to A is what we call a 5-1 movement, which, without getting sidetracked into an explanation of what that means, suffice it to say is the most common and satisfying bass movement that can happen at the end of a chord progression. So even that big jump at the end of the riff is there for a reason. So this kind of thing, this very smart use of inversions, is just one example of the craftsmanship that Eric Clapton brings to this song. And that attention to detail is really a hallmark of a great songwriter. All those little details add up, and that's often what makes the difference between a song that's maybe pleasant to listen to but nothing special, and a real enduring work of art. Real quick before we get to the demos, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and if you have any requests for songs I do in the future, you can go ahead and leave those in the comments.